Hi, everyone. It's John with CEG, back again. Okay, let's get the program going this morning. First, I want to tell you a little bit about Tangible Development. They provide full-service, customized diversity, equity, and inclusion solutions with measurable outcomes. The speaker this morning is Dr. L.B. Hannes. She uses a blend of scholarship as a researcher and practical hands-on experience as a diversity educator and higher education administrator. LB is a bridge builder and a problem solver with an expertise in organizational transformation. A skilled speaker and educator, LB has a featured TED Talk, which I watched yesterday, which was great, and was a part of Starbucks' third place speaker series in 2018. So Dr. LB, take over.
Thanks, John. Good morning, everybody. Excuse me. Happy Wednesday. Adjusting to being on Zoom without any other people, so just seeing myself, and so saying good morning to all the faceless people out there. Thanks for joining us on a Wednesday morning. I recently moved my family back up from North Central Florida, and we made the drive up on Thursday and Friday of last week, and I'm really pleasantly surprised with all the blooming trees and flowers. It's a really kind of hopeful and optimistic time weather-wise, and I won't mention the impending snow coming this weekend. Thank you for joining us for this topic this morning. Like John said, we at Tangible Development are an equity, diversity, inclusion consulting firm based here in Latham, New York. We work to develop customized solutions for organizations and companies that are working on inclusion work, diversifying their staff and their employee ranks, and really kind of general culture things. The topic this morning is one that we talk about often, but with a little bit of a tweak. We're all trying to do our normal stuff, but having to adjust and tweak and edit the way that we've typically done things, given the kind of state of affairs in our world right now. And so we're gonna talk about implicit bias, and we're gonna talk about implicit bias in general, but then what happens to us and our bias when we are facing a crisis, and in particular this crisis of COVID-19. Let's start with what bias generally is. We talk about bias both as a noun, something that is a tendency to believe that some people, ideas, ways of being are better than others, but bias is also a verb. You can be biased towards someone, you can act in a biased way, both implicitly and explicitly. For the purposes of this morning, we'll focus mostly on implicit because that's the harder to understand, it's the harder to manage. I think a lot of us know what explicit bias looks and feels like, and we've been conditioned and taught not to behave in that way or think in those kinds of ways. It's the implicit stuff that we all experience that tends to show up and even in best of times, in surprising and unexpected ways. And now that we're all under a lot of stress, they can manifest in even more surprising and unexpected ways. Where does bias come from? You know, I think most of us know that all of us have it. If you are human, you have bias, myself included, even as much work that I have done, both personally and professionally, to understand my own bias and work on it. I still have it. But bias is part of the human condition. We are born into the worlds that we are born into with all of the other kinds of mechanics in place. We have no ability, no control over the world that we're born into. We have no choice. Our process into consciousness we don't have any agency over that. The information that we do or do not get comes predominantly from our parents, our family, and the other adults that are in our world, in both good and bad ways. The good information, but also the biases, the stereotypes, the prejudices, the histories, the habits, the traditions that come with the worlds that we're born into. So that's what happens when we're born as babies and as young children. And then we're socialized by parents, relatives, teachers, people that we love and trust, faith leaders, government officials, all that kind of stuff, where we get our information about how to act, how to be, and we're socialized around what is right and what is wrong, and then everything in between. And then in addition to the individuals that shape our lives, we also have institutions and cultures that shape our lives. And so the institutions are things like churches and schools, TV, our legal system, our medical system, business, and the way that we're taught what is appropriate or not appropriate in the business context. And then cultural kind of institutions around language, song lyrics, media representations of different cultures and different kinds of people, and then just patterns of thought, what is right, what is wrong. And this happens on both conscious and unconscious levels. And the socializations and the people and the places that socialize us, those messages and those belief patterns are enforced and sanctioned through rewards and punishments. We can be celebrated for acting in a certain way. We can also be punished for acting in a certain way. So I'll give you an example in my own personal life. Half of my family is Greek. My grandmother was a first generation Greek American, and we grew up in both the Episcopal Church, but then also the Greek Orthodox Church. And my sister and I were tomboys as children. She grew out of it, I did not. And we had short hair as kids, and we hated wearing dresses. Now, in some families that short hair and dresses for girls is okay, and some it is not. In my family, it was generally okay for the most part. My parents let us dress how we wanted to. And we were about 8 and 10, and we went to the Greek Orthodox Church for a service. I can't remember which one it was. And we both were wearing pants. And the priest came up to us afterwards, me and my sister, separate from our parents, and told us that if we wanted to return to church, we had to wear dresses. We weren't allowed as young girls to wear pants in the Greek Orthodox Church. So you could see how I was born into a world where, short hair for girls and pants was an acceptable behavior. And to some extent, socialized that it was okay. But the institution of the church that I went to punished my sister and I for wearing pants and having short hair in the church. And that was deemed unacceptable behavior for us as young girls. Alternatively, we would have been celebrated for looking more feminine, for wearing dresses. And so rewards and punishments kind of reinforce what we know and how we act. And then, after it's enforced, that can result in silence and anger and frustration and guilt and stress. And certainly that was a stressful experience for my sister and I. And this cycle of socialization, as it's called, can continue until it's interrupted. And then you can choose to think differently, act differently. Luckily for my sister and I, we didn't internalize it too much and grew up to have some agency and not feel shame or guilt around how we choose to express ourselves. But that could have been a pretty damaging experience. Obviously, it was one that resonated with me. I still remember it very vividly. But bias, this is where it comes from. It comes from the world that we were growing up to. We're getting messages from all types of people and all types of places all at the same time, every single day. And what we know and what we don't know is very much based on where we grew up and where we came from. Some of us have opportunities to be exposed to different kinds of things and challenge our thinking around people and places, and some of us don't. A lot of this conversation around bias centers around these dimensions of identity, and we offer this as an image. And there's kind of like 3 dimensions, 3 circles of identity. The first circle, there's your personality that's informed by all of this, but that ring, you see things like age, gender identity, sexual orientation, physical ability, race and ethnicity, some other elements that are talked about more in the diversity world is size and people's body shape and body size. There's a lot of discrimination around people that are larger in our culture. The second kind of ring of dimensions is things like marital status, geographic location, income, personal habits, recreational habits, religion, your background, your educational background, your work experience, your appearance, and your parental status. And then that third ring is the organizational dimensions. So what division, department, unit group do you work in? Where do you fall in kind of the hierarchy of your company? Do you have more power or less power? Things like tenure, do you have some job security, or do you have a union? Do you have union affiliations that allow some protections in terms of workers' rights? What's the history of your company? Has your company done work before on diversity and inclusion, or has a history of working with certain populations? And so all of these kinds of dimensions are existing at the same time. You can't necessarily take one out and exist only in your gender identity or exist only in your parental status. There are moments when those are more important, and certainly we're seeing during the crisis things like parental status for those of us that have kids and have to juggle working from home while also parenting and helping kids do school from home. That definitely, for many of us, has become a very prominent experience and is taking up a lot of space in our minds and in our lives right now. But all of these things kind of exist together, and they inform each other. But these are also things in places where bias gets expressed. So if we go back to our psychosocialization here, we are taught about different people, and those differences typically fall along these lines. That's, as a white person, I was taught about, got messages about race, people of color from my family, from my community, growing up in a predominantly white community, got it from the media, both good and bad. And that was, it shapes implicit biases that I have around race and racism in the United States. We don't have bias, like I said earlier, because we're bad people. Bias in these categories that we have help us process information. As humans, we experience an abundance of information at any given moment. We categorize things to make sense of it and to help us exist and help us process and get through the day. If we weren't able to categorize things and make sense of things in relationship to things we already know, we would not be able to function because we would be overstimulated. Having categories to capture people and information helps us function. And this, from this Journal of Psychological Science, we see that at any given moment we're receiving 11 million bits of information, and we couldn't only consciously process around 40 bits of it. The rest of it is happening unconsciously. It's passing through us, it's going and getting stuck in our brain, and we process it in our dreams. We make sense of it and kind of store it away. But most of the information that we're processing, an overwhelming amount of it, something like 1% of it, we are only 1% of it we are managing in a conscious way. We use this quote often to remind people that we don't have bias because we're bad, but we have it because we're human. And the kind of the first step to managing our implicit bias, whether it be in crises or not, is acknowledging and accepting the fact that we have it. So I wanted to offer a couple common types of bias just to give a little structure and nuance to the conversation, because oftentimes when we think of implicit bias, it can seem like this big nebulous thing. And for some folks it's easier to see, and some folks it's not. And so here's some common types of bias that we've probably all experienced and certainly show up in the workplace. There's affinity bias, so also known as similarity bias, and is a tendency people have to connect with others who share similar interests, experiences, and backgrounds. And this can often happen along lines of identity, kind of going back to those dimensions of identity. We have a tendency to connect with people that are most like us, and that can happen around gender, that can happen around race, that can happen around age, it can happen around education and credentialing. and it can happen geographically. So, you know, are you more likely, as a person that grew up in the Northeast in this area and spent the last almost 10 years in North Central Florida, there are real geographical differences and biases that happen. And as a transplant, if I found out somebody was from the Northeast or from even upstate New York, or even more rare, the capital region, I immediately had a connection to that person, and I had an affinity for that person because we shared something that the majority of people around us did not share. Geographic bias is also a real thing. Coming from the North, I had it about the South, and then being in the South, there's geographic bias about people in the North. It goes both ways. But knowing what our affinity bias is, and how we connect to people and who we connect to more easily than others, and having some consciousness around that is really important. There's performance bias. So it refers to when it is assumed that some people are much better at certain tasks than others based on stereotypes. So women are perceived to be better at secretarial positions. They're perceived to be better adjusted to jobs that require more relationship-oriented things. Those are stereotypes, gender stereotypes. And so you might see in a meeting context, you might see people assuming that a woman colleague should take notes for the meeting versus men. Men are perceived to be stereotyped to be natural leaders or better leaders, and that can often result in roles or jobs being put on men that require some leadership or decision-making authority, just based on the fact that they are men. I'll give you an example from, I was in higher ed for a long time working with students, and we used something called Strengths Quest. It's much like all the other kind of like personality assessments out there. And we had to do an activity that the group had to do a task together, but only 3 of the 10 people could speak. And the group got to decide who spoke. And so based on their strengths quests, leader, follower kind of stuff, the group decided that the people that had this one trait, this leader trait in their strengths, should be the people that talked. And it happened to be that the people that had this trait as their top trait were the only men in the group. And so in an ironic, but probably could figure out why kind of way, the task of delegating authority went to all the men in the group based on this perception that having this quality of leader was going to be able to execute the task better than if you had a blend of experiences. There's confirmation bias, and confirmation bias is an inclination to draw conclusions about a situation or person based on your personal desires, beliefs, and prejudices, rather than on unbiased merit. So this can show up in many different ways, but this perception, again, going back to gender perceptions, that women are less confident than men. And so that can show up, we have confirmation, if there's that perception, or if you have that perception during a hiring process, if candidates come in and they seem nervous or they seem less assertive, women, this is proven through data, are perceived to be less confident if they show signs of nerves or anxiety in the hiring process. But knowing that the hiring process is a nervous and anxious producing experience for everybody, our perceptions color how we see nerves and anxiety, and give inflated amount of merit and belief to, and we associate those nerves and anxiety that women have to less confidence than their male counterparts. Attribution bias is a phenomenon where you try to make sense or judge a person's behavior based on prior observations and interactions you've had with that individual that make up your perception of them. So this could be based on how you saw someone show up in a conversation or at a conference, and maybe you had a bad experience, it left a bad taste in your mouth, but you've only had limited experiences with that person or limited amount of information, but you make up a decision based on that limited information, based on that small piece of information that you have. And so Ways to counterbalance that is to, think about whether or not you got a full picture of somebody else, observe them in different contexts so that you're not making a decision about them based on limited information. So conformity bias is the tendency people have to act similar to the people around them, regardless of their own personal beliefs or idiosyncrasies. So this, we're all familiar with peer pressure. If there's a common culture or way of being in the workplace, people are more likely to go with the norm rather than what they actually believe or how they function, just to go along to get along. And that peer pressure can be hard to counterbalance in the work environment. And then the last two I'll offer is the halo effect and the horns effect that are related to each other. The halo effect is a tendency people have to place another person on a pedestal after learning something impressive about them. I think we probably have all had that experience of someone else, of learning something impressive that they've done or that they know. And we've inflated what they know or who they are based on that one piece of information. And we put them on a pedestal. That can harm both that person, because you've put them on a pedestal and you've raised their expectations based on one thing that they've done. But it also can hurt the organization because you've raised the expectations for this person and put an over amount of emphasis on this one trait or this one accomplishment, and it can backfire. The horns effect is the tendency people have to view another person negatively after learning something unpleasant or negative about them. Again, pretty common. You might learn something about them personally or professionally that is negative or something unpleasant. And then you base all of your assumptions about that person based on that one bit of information that you have, and don't allow room for that person to show up in different ways. So really when we're talking about bias, we're talking about treating people and interacting with people based on limited information or incorrect information or misleading information. And so, in an everyday world, how we counterbalance that is to do some reflection and think about how much information do I have? Where did it come from? And how can I create more room for this person to show me who they are in different ways? But during crisis, that can be hard because things happen to us emotionally and psychologically during crisis. I really like this. It's kind of floating around the internet these days. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We use this often in the education context. But what it tells us and shows us is that there is a hierarchy of needs in terms of ability for people to function. At the bottommost rung is you need to have your basic needs, your physiological needs met: food, water, shelter, health, sense of safety. And the pandemic that we're in has rocked most of those things for a lot of people. Many folks have lost their jobs or are furloughed. Their access to income has evaporated. And then that impacts whether or not they can feed their family, whether or not they can pay their rent. So for many of us, our basic needs have at the very least become insecure, and at the worst become pretty dire. My brother lost his job weeks ago. He just got his unemployment check yesterday. And so we've had to kind of like coalesce around them, help them with food, help them with rent, things like that. The next rung up is psychological safety. And during the times that we're in right now, psychological safety is a hard thing to have all the time. The threat of being sick, the multitude of unknowns really rock our sense of psychological safety. We don't know when it will be over. We're not sure how the economy is going to recover. We're not sure, how bad it's going to get, or if we're going to be able to get through this thing, better than assumed. And so most of us are right where that blue arrow points, where it says you are here. A lot of us are kind of toggling between physiological safety and psychological safety. The rest of the things up the chain are things that we need to be healthy, whole humans: love and belonging with our family, a healthy sense of self-esteem, and then self-actualization. So fulfillment in who we are, fulfillment in work, fulfillment in our spiritual and religious beliefs, fulfillment and self-actualization as a person. But if we can't meet those basic needs at the bottom, we can't reach those other kinds of levels of needs. And the amount of stress that exists when trying to meet those needs at the bottommost rungs of this hierarchy of needs is high. We can't reach self-esteem and self-actualization if our stress is very high. And there's a lot of data out there about what happens to our bodies when we are stressed. But I really appreciate this very neurological kind of language, but what it says very succinctly is that stress elicits a switch from an analytic reasoning system, so our consciousness and our rational brain, to intuitive processes. So our gut response, emotional responses, physiological responses, and it predicts that this switch is associated with diminished activity in the prefrontal executive control region, so the part of our brains that is rational and logical, and it exaggerates activity in the subcortical reactive emotional brain areas, so the parts of our brain that is emotional. So there's a link between where we sit on this hierarchy of needs and the amount of stress, the daily stress that we are experiencing. And our emotional brains are taking up more room than they typically do because of we're in a worldwide crises. And so what happens to us during crises and in the face of uncertainty, we're biased to perceive the world as we would like it to be, not necessarily as it is. We're searching for some sort of control. And so our biases become inflated because we're searching for how we want it to be. And typically how we want it to be is related to what is comfortable, what is known, the things that we have affinity for. So we go back to those places of affinity, things that are like us, things that I know, things that have some certainty to it. And in those places, a lot of bias exists. During crises, our intelligence and our rational brains abandon us when we try to reason about facts that conflict with our personal biases. So when we talk about implicit bias, the term cognitive dissonance comes up often. And cognitive dissonance is a psychological term that refers to the real kind of uncomfortable feeling we feel when what we've always taken to be true, new information comes in and conflicts with that information and what we knew to be true. And there's a real kind of like discomfort when new information challenges what we've always known. But during crises, when we have the kind of cognitive dissonance and what we've always known to be true, rather than having the intelligence and the rational brain lead us through that discomfort, our emotions come in and try to react to that discomfort. We don't want to be more uncomfortable than we already are. We're already uncomfortable with uncertainty and trying to have our basic physical and psychological needs met. So they can make this conflict feel even heightened and take up more space in our world. And then the other thing that happens during crises is that we select information from places and sources based on what is comfortable to us. We all get our information typically from places that we trust, and we want to make sure that we're being extra critical about where we're getting information from, and we're not seeking information that is soothing just to soothe us, but really information that is rooted in expert sources, that is rooted in places that are not going to tell us things just to feel comfortable or tell us what we already know, but rather tell us what the facts are. So it kind of becomes a perfect storm of these inherent implicit biases that we have based on our lived experience in the worlds that we grew up in, the everyday stressors that we have, having to meet our basic needs, having to parent, having to do our job in a brand new, most of us are working in a remote context, not being able to do the things and have the outlets that we normally have, and then build in all the things that happens to our bodies and our brains when crisis happens. And you get kind of that perfect storm of stress and that perfect storm of emotions that makes it hard to manage all of these things. So the possibilities for implicit bias goes up, the feeling of stress for everyday things like parenting and making a meal, it feels harder. And our emotional and psychological response to stress, it just kind of kicks up and kicks up. And so that's what happens to us personally. Organizationally, something can happen called emotional contagion. And this certainly happens very easily in a physical context when we're in physical locations together in the work context. Emotional contagion is the transfer of moods and feelings from one person to another. And so we've all been in a work context when, someone shows up in a bad mood and they maybe react to you in a way, and then you're in a bad mood, and then it continues, or there's a piece of bad information, or someone dislikes another employee, and that it becomes contagious. This gets super heightened during crises because there's a lot of negative emotions, particularly fear and anxiety, that cause us to become very rigid in our decision making. We're less creative, we're less analytical, and we make worse decisions, and that can be contagious between people within the work environment. So I imagine that little red dot that's in the kind of the sweet spot between those three concentric circles becoming kind of bouncing between people. If that's the red dot of crisis response and stress and bias kind of pops around to people throughout the organization. However, there's also a possibility of we're seeing lots of examples of emotional contagion in the positive context too. There's something called an affect spiral, so it can lead to greater cooperation and less conflict within groups when emotions are positive rather than negative. So we're seeing many examples of this in the world right now, where organizations are kind of rallying behind a cause, or rallying behind contributing, to the pandemic, getting behind serving others. Emotional contagion can go both ways. It can be both negative and positive. But not everybody is experiencing the impact of the coronavirus equally. And so when we talk about stress and we're talking about everyday stressors, we also have to acknowledge that it's impacting different populations and different people differently. I really like this quote. Another one that's popping around the internet these days is, I heard that we're all in the same boat, but it's not like that. We're in the same storm, but not in the same boat. Your ship could be shipwrecked and mine not be, or vice versa. So as we're thinking about our experience of stress during these times and what people are experiencing, some people are experiencing much more stress than others, and that will have an impact on how they show up at work, and then how they can effectively manage our biases. So thinking about the impact of communities, this certainly isn't an exhaustive list, but it's important to think about. Thinking about women are assumed to be the predominant caretakers of children in the household, and that amount of work that typically is on women, plus having to work from home, puts a heightened amount of stress on women, and particularly women that have households and kids to take care of, and managing the multiple kind of balls that requires. We know that people of color are experiencing, in particular Black and African American communities, are experiencing disproportionate rates of illness and death in COVID-19. I just had a call with a client group yesterday, and there were several Black women in the group that I was working with, and many of them, two of them had multiple people that died just this week from COVID-19. So we know that Black and African American communities are getting hit harder rate-wise when it comes to the pandemic. Communities with high Latinx, Hispanic and Latinx populations have been hit hard. Right here in New York State, we have, the epicenter of the epicenter in Queens. We know that there's increased rates of racially motivated violence towards Asians and Asian Americans based on the stereotypes and the assumptions that the illness came from China, and that China is to blame for the coronavirus. Low income and frontline workers, we know this to be true. Our healthcare professionals, our essential workers in grocery stores and facilities folks that clean hospitals, that clean the places that are still open. have a disproportionate amount of stress and exposure to COVID-19. Those populations of workers are also, they're disproportionately represented by folks of color and women in those roles. So you're starting to see some themes and trends across how populations are impacted differently. And people with disabilities and immunocompromised people are also impacted differently and are at higher risk during COVID-19. So thinking about how those folks are keeping safe and reducing their exposure. So I have a little less than 10 minutes before we open it up to questions and answers. And I know I've thrown a lot of information at you, but when we talk about interrupting bias, we like to pose it in two different layers. How can individuals take concrete steps to interrupt bias? And then what kind of organizational practices can companies and organizations take to interrupt bias, but build it into their policy and practice? So I'm going to offer a couple for both. So when it comes to personally in managing implicit bias, we have it. Don't pretend like you don't. And it's going to happen and come up way more often during crises, just because of our stress response and our ability to have a conscious, rational prefrontal cortex brain leading the way. Question your first impressions and your reactions more often than usual. Slow down, take more time to think about why you're perceiving this person this way. If a more explicit bias comes through your brain or comes out of your mouth, take a moment to step back and think about what happened, where did that come from, what other factors are going on in my life that limited my ability to filter. It doesn't excuse your behavior or the bias, but there's some reasoning and rationale for it that you can learn from, and then maybe apply a different approach in the future. So overall, slow down in all ways. Slow down in your decision making, slow down in your responses. Try to manage your stress. All of this stuff isn't rocket science, but it's important. Try to manage your stress if you can, as best as possible. Build in more time for de-escalating your stress. If there's a conversation happening over Zoom and it's triggering you and making you feel stressed out, or you're having some kind of emotional response, rather than putting that out to the group, maybe take a step back and take some time to think about why you're having that response and why maybe it's heightened in the moment. Think about, would I have reacted the same way if I weren't in these stressful conditions? Reduce your consumption of stressful information, whether it be the news, and this goes hand in hand with that last bullet point, reduce the flow of information. Reduce your time on Facebook, reduce your time on Twitter, my mom likes to call me every day. I don't watch much of the news these days. I read the New York Times and a couple other things, and then I get off. She likes to call me and tell me about everything that she's seen on the TV that day. And I have to say, you know what, Mom, time out. This is not good for me. It's not helpful for me. She is retired and has, less responsibilities. I have a job and kids. The amount of stress that I have in my life is different than hers. And so I have to cut her off and reduce my own consumption in the flows of information that come to me. I don't listen to NPR as much as I used to. Just reduce and think about what's helpful for you in terms of managing your stress. And then be critical of non-expert sources. The beauty and the challenge of the internet is that we have access to all kinds of information, good and bad, and everything in between. Be critical of the sources that you're getting your information from, and think about whether or not it's helpful to what you need to know for that day to get through. Identify and practice helpful coping strategies. So like I mentioned, take more time to respond to people and issues that trigger emotional responses. Things that weren't triggers for emotional responses before the pandemic likely are now. And so take more time, step back from a meeting and take a walk, process with somebody's, your spouse or a friend or a confidant at work. Hey, this bothered me. Did it bother you? Talk through things more than you typically would. And the biggest thing I can say is don't pretend like it's not bothering you. Don't pretend like you're not stressed out. Don't pretend like you're not having emotional responses to things. Acknowledge what you're feeling. Don't make it more than it has to be, but also pretending like you aren't feeling it and stuffing it away is only going to make it worse. So acknowledge it and find ways to move through it. Write things out, journal, talk to people. If you have a good therapist, talk about it with your therapist. That's not to say that we should ignore a problem. So if a bias incident happens, or if there's an issue that's particularly triggering to you, or that it's stressful, or a disagreement or a conflict that you have, don't ignore it, but be purposeful. And I'm going to offer you a strategy, an organizational strategy in the next slide. And remember that individuals and organizations that believe they are objective and that they don't have bias often exhibit the most bias because they're ignoring a very common and human problem. So organizationally, and you can use this personally, I suggest using and adjusting often the Eisenhower matrix, or you might have heard it as the Covey matrix, or the Covey quadrants. In a crisis, this quadrant has become like my go-to, tool to be like, in right now, today, what is urgent and important? What is not urgent but important? What is urgent and not important, and what is not urgent and not important. And those things are going to change daily for you, both as a person and organizationally. Some things that were not important and not urgent months ago have very quickly shot up into that top left quadrant. Figuring out how to, get people to work remotely went from a nicety, maybe we'll get to it, to a urgent and important function. With that comes a lot of potential biases and stereotypes, right? We're assuming that people know how to work remotely and are facilitate technology well. That can impact people that are older, that don't have as much exposure and experience with technology. That assumption and just getting people kind of online really quickly without the right supports, having some assumptions and bias around people's access to reliable internet. People might not have the same kind of access. So thinking about that. And so using this matrix often in adjusting your work around it is really important and can be a good tool for managing the multiple stressors that are happening. During a crisis, it's important to acknowledge how it's been impacting differently. So thinking back to those populations that are experiencing the coronavirus differently. In organizational practice, to not ignore that and assume that everybody is having a similar experience is to build in check-in times and meetings. So I'm hearing from lots of clients that are like, we're jumping into all these Zoom meetings and we're just doing business as usual, and it can feel very overwhelming. A suggestion would be to, for each meeting, build in some check-in time. It doesn't have to be, and this is, if you have a manageable group, everybody has a minute, or do a 2-word check-in. How are you feeling today? Let people kind of name where they're at, and then it'll allow people to be more centered rather than trying to ignore the fact that my kid is knocking on the door and won't leave me alone. Check in with those most impacted by the virus. So again, those that have kids at home, those that, potentially experience higher rates of exposure and illness. Check in with folks that are impacted by the virus personally. And encourage people to share their experiences. If you're in a supervisory context, let's not assume that people are all having the same experience. When you're checking in with folks one-on-one, ask them how they're doing, ask them what they're scared about, asking about their stress, asking about how their stress is impacting how they're doing their work. When bias incidents do occur, and they'll happen just as common, if not more, during a crisis, empower everyone to call out the bias, starting with yourself, and not in like a shaming way, but hey, this wasn't right. I want to name it, and move, and let's find ways to process it and then move from it. If you act in a biased way towards another person, solicit. It's a good practice to apologize and ask from any inputs or any kind of feedback from that person, and then say thank you when someone has acknowledged some bias, rather than our kind of shame responses to kind of push it away and say, I didn't mean that. Let's step into it, acknowledge it, say thank you, and apologize. And then overall, just show a lot of compassion for yourself and for others during this time. And elevating our relationships in our work is really important. There are some tasks that will fall lower on the to-do list that we're just not going to get to, but we have to take care of our people, because if we're not taking care of our people, then our work is going to suffer and we won't be able to sustain and come out of this in a good place if our people were felt like they weren't taken care of by their company during a very stressful and emotional time. So I will stop there. I just threw a ton of information at you, and I know we only have about 10 minutes left.
Hi, LB, this is John interjecting. On the bottom toolbar, you do have a Q&A option where you can write in a question, and we encourage that. And I have two that have come in that I can discuss with and present to you, LB. One is, can we ever rid ourselves of having bias?
Yeah, no, you can't. Like I said before, bias is a product of where we come from, and so much of it is so deeply rooted, and it goes back to when we were children. We can't necessarily rid ourselves of all bias, but we can have strategies and mechanisms for filtering them out and acknowledging when it comes up and where it comes from. Much like any kind of this is maybe a crass comparison, but like any kind of addiction or any kind of like long-term management of some kind of health issue, you have to manage it. It doesn't necessarily go away, but as you get older and you think about it and you manage it and you take control of it and you acknowledge it, you're able to more effectively manage it. And there will be times when it gets out of control, and you just have to respond to it, take care of the harm that you caused, and then get back to those coping strategies that that you've been working on and trying to manage the bias that you come with.
Okay, thank you. I actually have two more to go. Do you have any advice or guidance for managing multiple generations in the workplace, specifically a younger generation managing and leading an older generation through this crisis and this shift in the workplace?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a couple things come to mind. I think there has to be a sweet spot between acknowledging generational differences and then not making them and having the generation differences be inflated. So there are some generational things between the generations, right? In particular, there's a great infographic around, and I can share it. I don't have it right now, about how different generations consume media and consume news and consume social media. That's really important to take into context. Younger generations are much more versatile around social media and around information on the internet, are not because they're better, but just because as millennials and younger, we just have had access to the internet we've had more experience with it over the amount of time that we've been alive. So, and then so older generations, have less versatility and experience with it. So I think finding a balance between acknowledging how each generation is experiencing this this coronavirus differently. Younger generations are managing things like parenting and disappointment around. A lot of folks are graduating. I finished my Ph.D. and I was very much looking forward to walking the stage, and I had to really kind of swallow that bitter pill of not being able to celebrate my accomplishment. And that's what younger generations are feeling. Older generations are experiencing, they're the population that are most at risk for this coronavirus. So those are different kinds of experiences and different kinds of worries. I think you need to create space for people to name what they're going through and talk across generations. So I would open up the dialogue between the generations and the younger folks managing the older folks, and just kind of naming them, letting people acknowledge them, but then also not letting it get into this, well, you're younger, you won't understand, or you're older, you won't understand kind of dichotomy that we get into. So That's what I would say initially is how do you open up dialogues to talk about and name the generational differences, and then where can you find commonality points? Where are the common points that regardless of what generation that you're in, that you share? And so it'll allow the differences to be named, but then also have everybody coalesce around the similarities and the shared purpose, the shared struggles, the shared hopes that everybody is experiencing right now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, another question. I work with startups often. What early steps can they take to make sure they build a culture of non-bias? Startups often don't put much thought into operations at this level.
Yeah, good question. There's a lot of great resources, our company, but then also, resources out on the internet about how to build in gender neutral, race neutral hiring practices, build in mechanisms for how to recruit and hire from a more bias-free way. Again, you can't rid bias from anything, but there are tools and strategies like removing names from resumes and things like that in terms of an initial pass through. And if you have the opportunity to build that from the ground up, you're going to be ahead because you're not undoing things that have been historically done with companies that are much older that have had to change and catch up. So if you do your research and do some assessments around what are bias neutral ways that we can recruit and build into our recruitment and hiring practices, having equity process advisors and someone who's part of the hiring process to look out for bias in the process will be a good practice to have. And then building a culture really where bias is talked about and named. So much of company culture treats bias and bias related incidences, as something that immediately has to go to HR. Now there is plenty of stuff that should go, through a formal HR process, but most of it is really just like cultural, people interacting kind of stuff. And you need to create a culture of it's okay to kind of have conflict and name it and work through it and manage the kind of like the messiness of people as part of our company culture. So when something happens, it's addressed. I was working with a client where they were on a all company wide Zoom call, and someone had unintentionally used a colloquialism that was anti-Semitic, but it was a kind of an everyday phrase, and the whole company heard it, and the executive director did the right thing and called this person out and kind of named it and said, I got to say, that use of that word is not okay. We're really trying to be better about this. But there were many people, I heard from many people in that company who thought that the executive director calling that person out in front of everybody and naming that was not the right move, because they were taught that all of those things should be done behind closed doors. So questioning traditional approaches to leadership, many people, especially older generations, were taught that stuff should happen behind closed doors. But, my position back to them would be silence is consent in a lot of these things. If that kind of language is allowed to happen, particularly in an all staff context, we're giving permission for that to continue. And so there's ways to kind of call it out. I don't want to necessarily use a like big bad call out culture myth that happens, but just kind of like name it. Acknowledge it. And then we were, since then I've worked with them to help them work through it and have it be a learning lesson so that folks can create a culture where not everything is punitive, but, everything can be, folks can talk about stuff in real time and build a culture where we're going to work on this together. We're going to acknowledge the problems and kind of work on it together. So if you can build a culture of that from the beginning, I think that you'll be further ahead than lots of places.
Okay, LB, I think we have one last question. It's close to what you were just discussing. How do we handle a situation when the other person doesn't believe what they said was bias?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I think, personally, I'm a big advocate for advocating for yourself and kind of naming the hurt and naming what your experience was like. So I think that people should still do that, even if the other person won't acknowledge it. You present the opportunity for it to be a learning environment. Now, if you do that and the other person rejects or resists what was said, I think you have two options. You have the option to take that as information about the other person and how to engage with them in the future, and the other option, and just step away from it. Or the other option is to use more formal routes, supervisor, things like that, to help the person see at least that this kind of language was not okay. They don't necessarily have to agree or understand, but there has to be some kind of acknowledgement and baseline of what kind of language is okay and what is not okay in the work context. And if you doing it one-on-one is not successful, then I think you have to take more formal routes, like going to your supervisor, and then kind of the formal channels of your organization to get some standards set for what kind of language is permissible and okay in the work environment.
Okay, thank you very much. I am pleased to say that this session was recorded and will be up on the CEG website shortly, so that you can share it with your business associates and staff members. You also see on the screen in the top right corner in green is LB's contact information at Tangible, and you can contact us at CEG to connect with LB. And LB, we thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and expertise in this area and helping companies, through an unusual time right now and their missions going forward.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.